know, we're just moving through the book. So anyway, welcome to our second meeting for Society of the Spectacle. And as I was just going over for a few people who maybe didn't get the first meeting, we're going through the book slowly. I'm reading the whole thing slowly aloud, a few paragraph or two at a time, and then we're discussing that. And this then we'll go on, and I'll read further. And this first chapter, which we're in the middle of right now, is the hardest in the book, partly because it's sort of an introductory, like overture to the whole thing. So many of the things he's talking about are kind of abstract, like how does this concept spectacle, what is it? It has different aspects. You can look at it in different ways. All this. So it's kind of taking an overview. And then in the later chapters that follow it, we will see various aspects of the spectacle. Like the next time we'll be talking about the economic things, like how does it relate to capitalism and so on. So things will get easier. This first chapter is just hard because when you look at it, you may think, well, what is he talking about? In the other chapters, in most cases, you'll know at least what he's talking about. Even if there's still some difficulties, you'll know he's talking about art or talking about some historical event or about language or about various kinds of things. So don't be discouraged. And yes, thank you. I need to mute everybody. Mute all. Okay, I've muted everybody, and Kim, you can unmute yourself as needed if you need to point something else. So the other thing in the chat is give the thesis number we're on. Yes, I will definitely be doing that. So last meeting, we read about the first, I think, 16 theses. These little numbered paragraphs are usually referred to as a thesis. So I'm not going to go over those. We'll just plunge right in here. And then bear in mind, we'll keep coming back. This is all kind of interrelated. So don't worry, if you're not sure about something, the discussion may help it out too. So number 17, the first stage of the economy's domination of social life brought about an evident degradation of being into having. Human fulfillment was no longer equated with what one was, but with what one possessed. So he's talking here about maybe a century or two ago, where things became more monetary and stuff. The Industrial Revolution, capitalism is coming on. The present stage, like in the middle of the 20th century, he's talking about, or the 20th century, in which social life has become completely occupied by the accumulated productions of the economy, is bringing about a general shift from having to appearing. All having must now derive its immediate prestige and its ultimate purpose from appearances. At the same time, all individual reality has become social, in the sense that it is shaped by social forces and is directly dependent on them. Individual reality is allowed to appear only insofar as it is not actually real. And I'll go on to this next thesis and then we'll stop. When the real world is transformed into mere images, which is what's been happening, Mere images become real beings, figments that provide the direct motivations for a hypnotic behavior. Since the spectacle's job is to use various specialized mediations in order to show us a world that can no longer be directly grasped, it naturally elevates the sense of sight to the special preeminence once occupied by touch. The most abstract and easily deceived sense is the most readily adaptable to the generalized abstraction of present-day society. But the spectacle is not merely a matter of images, nor even of images plus sounds. It is whatever escapes people's activity, whatever eludes their practical reconsideration and correction. It is the opposite of dialogue. Wherever representation becomes independent, the spectacle regenerates itself. So let's talk about those two theses. And let's see how many people we have. We just have 20, which is enough. So it's still helpful if you raise your digital hand, because then I will see you at the top of my screen. But um, uh, and then I'll unmute you. But actually, yeah, let's just try it that way for right now. Does anybody have some questions or comments about those two theses? And you can also say something in the chat if there. So Ed Matthews, unmute yourself. Okay. Spotlight. There you go.
Okay, I think I can hear myself.
Yes.
These two passages make me think about the deepening credit crisis that many people find themselves in this day and age, beginning back then, because he talks about we're going from being to having accumulations, and then from having to appearing. In other words, appearing to be wealthy, appearing to have the ability to sort of conspicuous consumption. And the way he's describing it, and again, not explicit, but I get the sense that what he's describing here, this sort of fiction that people are living, not necessarily reification, but consumers being perhaps richer than they really are, sort of playing up appearances, that this credit system that we're stuck in is a kind of microfascism, because it also holds people back. And I was just writing on the side here, not only that, but sight is endlessly deferred and delayed. It occupies leisure time, the busyness of looking that as if you are rich, that you have a certain social position, as false as it may be, but it is keeping up appearances. So in a very theoretical way, I get this very real sense that perhaps that's what he's discussing without using the word credit.
Yeah. He does mention credit once or twice, just incidentally, which is just starting at that time. Eric, if you can unmute yourself.
I think actually Edward sort of touched on some of the stuff that I had questions about. So thanks, Edward.
Oh,
Oh, did I click the wrong person here? Well, Peter.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. You're here. We will get back to let's see who was anyway, Peter, you were one of those with hands raised.
Yeah, I mean, one or two observations, just that with 17 and 18, there's an interesting discussion without naming the commodity, talking about the complete dominance of the commodity in consumer society, consumer capitalism. And then when he talks about individual reality being allowed to appear only insofar as it is not actually real, I get a sense of celebrity, which I think he's going to talk about later, and this appearance of freedom in capitalism that isn't really free. It's just this image of what we could have in a society, right? And then in terms of 18, I think that it's really interesting where he talks about the spectacle not merely a matter of images or images plus sounds, but it's what escapes our understanding. And I think what's escaping is that capitalism and those social relations are really directing what's going on. But again, he's not naming it yet, but it's really interesting. He's kind of dancing around it.
Yeah, that one point I think is one of the most important points in the book, as well as in the description of what the spectacle is. It's like as a sort of rudimentary thing, we can think, okay, spectacles, you're sitting there watching something, so you're being passive and you're receiving things. So that gives you a rough sense, but there's a lot of things that are not a matter of something you're looking at. Maybe you're just hearing about something, or maybe you're sensing something is around you in this. But the point is that you're still helpless like a spectator in the sense that this is out of your control. It's just, you don't even, it's hard for you even to figure out where it's coming from. It's just, they say that blah, blah, blah. You know, it's kind of, it can include vague things like that, or it can include very not vague things, like the president, the dictator says this, and you better pay attention or you'll be in jail.
Exactly.
You know, in one way or the other. So it's in some ways it's kind of Kafkaesque, like in the trial. You know, you're on trial, but you don't even know what for, you know, but it's like, well, who's the judge? Well, I don't know. Somebody, you know, go in that room and wait, and somebody will come and do this. And it's like a nightmare that you're caught in. And it's kind of an exaggerated thing, but a lot of modern life is kind of like that. And like Kafka was picking up on that a century ago. Um, so, anyway, well zeroed in on that point. Ed, you got another question here? Comment?
Yeah, I was just going to add very quickly that if you go back to section 6, where he talks about the spectacle as the model of the prevailing way of life, choices have already been made.
Yeah.
Right? Your book's written, and you are a passive consumer. There's no way around it. And then not only that, but it monopolizes the majority of the time spent outside the modern production process. There is no outside. That's the thing. That's what's so totalitarian about it. There is no outside. There is no leisure time. There's just the fiction of it. And of course, what do you do in your leisure time? Spend money. You know, got to get a new motorbike, got to get a new car, or buy a BMW if David's is still available. But we end up being part of that system, no matter what we're doing. And that's the line to me that always sticks out. Choices have already been made.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's like Margaret Thatcher or somebody who says there is no alternative. So what are you people talking about? This is it.
Yeah, there is no
You know, there
society.
used to be an alternative. You could say go to Russia. That's the alternative. And now that that's collapsed, you know, it's clear that this is the status quo is it. So stop complaining. Sid, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Ed, I think that was a great point. And one of the points that's most clear to me. What's not so clear is on 18, I think it's 18, where it says generalized abstraction of present, adaptable to the generalized abstraction of present day society. So I don't really know what that means. The most abstract, and I understand about sight. You know, I've actually noticed that there's, you know, my tendency is to experience things with my eyes and sight. And you know, one of the first things I did was do photography, was like a way of interacting with the world, versus touch, which, you know, is more of a child, you know, a baby's way of interacting with the world. You know, it's like very direct. Is that what they're talking about in terms of abstraction? I'm not quite clear about what.
I think the abstraction is more general than that. It's not just that it's a visual society in the sense that sight is more abstract, but that society itself, the things that you're taking in, whether it's visual or sound or even things you're touching, have an abstract quality about them because, like the commodities, like the whole thing, things tend to resemble each other. Like if you're watching a program, you see a bunch of stars going by, and they may have their distinct personalities or something so-called, but basically you're just seeing here's another person, uh, doing a song or doing a speech or something, and they're mutually replaceable. They're all if we're all talking, to go back to that thing, the choice already made, if there's a choice that has been already made without really being discussed openly, um, uh, for example, we may have a political choice that is presented, like you either have to vote for this guy or this guy. And that may be true, but somehow, like, who decided that? And you can say, oh, well, it was voted, this person won the primary and da da da, so it's fair and there's nothing you can do about it. But really, that whole thing is kind of weird. Like, who said, that the fate of the billions of people is dependent upon the flukes that can happen in a political campaign or a PR campaign about whether somebody's more popular or whether somebody made a faux pas or that ruined their campaign or ridiculous things like this. And yet the official reality, you have no choice. It's either this or this. And if you're not serious, maybe you're going for this thing over here, but that's irrelevant. So that we can make fun of you for that. And the idea is that so there's something that in itself is kind of an abstract thing. Like there's all these decisions about policies that make differences, like whether we're going to stop global warming or not, or whether a war is going to happen, or whether people will starve to death or not, and things like that come down to this thing like, well, 49% of people voted for this, but 51% said this thing over here, and those people are voting abstractly in most cases. They're just voting like something that feels good, or that somebody told them was the serious alternative. Or so it's just the abstraction can also be things like just a sort of general dumbing down. Or it can be like the abstraction, like you're picking up a detective novel and you can't remember whether you read it before because they sort of all have the same plots or something, not to get on detective novels or something, but it's things like this that have become not very personal. They've become like you just have your choice of which bestseller are you going to buy. And if you're more picky, maybe you don't buy the bestsellers, but you buy something else, but you still are kind of caught in it because you're proud that you bought something else. You didn't follow into this thing. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, let's see here. Add spotlight to B Shep.
Guys hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm loving the group. I'm Benjamin in Brooklyn, everyone. I just wanted to point to the end of the 18th thesis, which I love. But the spectacle is not merely a matter of images, not even the images plus sounds. It is whatever escapes people's activity, whatever eludes their practical reconsideration and correlation. It is the opposite of
And
dialogue.
correction,
Yes.
not correlation. In
Yes,
other words,
yes.
they can't do anything about it. They can't say, wait a minute.
Right. So I guess I see the marks in so much of this, but I'm also wondering about the Marcuse. I don't know whether it seems like if it's the opposite of dialogue, it's the opposite of democracy. It's the opposite of free discourse. Is that what he's saying? Because that sounds like reification. And I don't know if that's the correct interpretation, whether there's a correct interpretation or not, but this does feel like he's describing a form of reification, a flattening out.
Sure. Oh, of course, this whole book is about that.
Right. Right.
I mean,
Right.
that's
Right.
just another way of look. He could have done something, and in fact, people like Lukács, uh,
Right.
with History and Class Consciousness about half a century earlier, I think he called that, the subtitle was A Study in Reification or something.
Right.
And you could say that that's what Marx was doing. They're
Right.
looking at different aspects, and you could also say alienation. They're not
Right.
identical, but they're sort of like the same.
I
They're
think
ways
so.
of talking about much of the same stuff.
I mean, and the flattening out, the aesthetic dimension
Yeah.
Herbert Marcuse talks about feels like it's part of this. We can't have a robust conversation. We're looking at images. We're looking at flattened images. And I'm
Yeah.
not knocking art history. But this feels like two-dimensional conversation without
Yeah.
complexity.
Right. Yes, indeed.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, sure. Let's just move on, and we can always come back to some of these things. As I say, they'll overlap anyway. Going on to number 19 and 20, these are about philosophy. The spectacle inherits the weakness of the Western philosophical project, which attempted to understand activity by means of the categories of vision. And it is based, the spectacle, on the relentless development of the particular technical rationality that grew out of that form of thought, namely the philosophical mode. The spectacle does not realize philosophy in the sense of fulfilling it. It philosophizes reality, reducing everyone's concrete life to a universe of speculation. Philosophy, the power of separate thought and the thought of separate power, was never by itself able to supersede theology. The spectacle is the material reconstruction of the religious illusion. Spectacular technology has not dispersed the religious mists into which human beings had projected their own alienated powers. It has merely brought those mists down to earth, to the point that even the most mundane aspects of life have become impenetrable and unbreathable. The illusory paradise representing a total denial of earthly life, which was heaven, is no longer projected into the heavens. It is embedded in earthly life itself. The spectacle is the technological version of the exiling of human powers into a world beyond, the culmination of humanity's internal separation. So I'll make little comments before we have the question. So the idea, he's obviously taking a whole lot of stuff. He's just saying the Western philosophical project, this is like 2,500 years or a little more than that even of thought in Europe and so on, from the pre-Socratics to Aristotle and Plato and so on through the Middle Ages and Kant and Hegel and Descartes and up to modern times. And he's saying this whole thing is a project. You can look at it in a certain way, just like Hegel looked back on philosophy and saw all these different philosophies as sort of part of one movement, as even though they conflicted with each other. So Debord is saying this project, despite all these differences, it was a project that says, let's look at reality here. Let's analyze it out, see what the world's made out of, see what society is made out of, where we're going, how logic works, how thought works, consciousness, all these various things. And so that was a project. And in retrospect, since Marx in particular, you look back on that and say, well, that kind of made sense, like you're trying to understand the world and all this. And there was sort of an assumption that if you understand the world, you'll do better, you'll know what you should do or know how to work in the world and so on. But with Marx, to oversimplify things, Marx in the Theses on Feuerbach says, so far the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. So obviously, to change the world, you have to interpret it. You have to know what's going on, what you want to change, and so on. But the Marx point is obviously a condensed way of saying this understanding of the world gets to a certain point where it's just off in the clouds. It's kind of abstract, and you're saying, what are we going to do with this knowledge? Or is it even knowledge? It gets so abstract you don't really know. How can you prove this is true and all this stuff? So Debord is saying that there is this project which was not meaningless. It was something that keen minds, over the centuries were trying to do. But he's saying that it was looking at the world in the categories of vision. The categories, is this far or near, is this in or out, things like this. And he's saying that the spectacle is sort of the end result of that, like where it's flipped into not the opposite of philosophy exactly, but a sort of perverted upside down philosophy where all those bad aspects of philosophy are sort of realized, and the good aspects, like this can be a way of liberation, are suppressed. And then in number 20, where he goes on, in Marx's day, along with Feuerbach, the same thing, just coming after Hegel, the idea that Marx and Engels and other people like that were looking at was like religion was the problem. And that goes back to the 18th century with Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot and people like that. They're looking at that and they're saying theology, which is sort of a philosophy of religion, you might say, there's something fundamentally wrong with it. It's bullshit, or it's at least partially bullshit. And so part of their struggle was to overcome theology and the idea, well, philosophy will do that. Philosophy doesn't have this religious, superstitious stuff. But Debord is saying that philosophy never by itself couldn't get beyond theology. Because to get beyond theology, it would have to understand the underpinnings of theology and religion. Why does this stuff even come up in the first place? And the underpinnings of it are more material. In other words, it does that because it's a class society, and the rulers have certain interests, and they want to suppress other ideas and blah blah blah. So Debord is also incidentally saying philosophy, parenthesis, the power of separate thought. So it's like it's thought, but it's like thought that's not very connected with reality, and the thought of separate power, i.e., it's the ideology of rulers. It's the notion that you have people at the top that decide how things are and everybody else follows orders, so to speak. And philosophy could be seen as sort of a analog to that, where you have the mind, the intellect is surveying reality and dominating it. And if you're not intellectual or something, you're just the people carrying out the plowing the fields and working in the factories or something. So he's saying, incidentally, that that's part of what the flaw of philosophy is, that it's not confronting that connection with material reality. And so the philosophers thought they were going to get beyond religion, and have the sort of rational understanding of how the world worked. But he's saying that it didn't turn out that way. The philosophers end up being sort of de facto apologists for the system. Even if they try to oppose the system, they don't really know how to do it because they're thinking top down in this way. And so what happened instead is that you have this social thing called you have capitalism, and then you have this thing called the spectacle that is sort of a later development of capitalism, where the spectacle has some things in common with religion. Um, Namely, that it's kind of an unreal thing that grips people, that people start taking more seriously what's on the TV screen than in real life, just like they start taking seriously some imaginary friends up in heaven, that they've never even seen, just because they've heard about it, and it kind of solves things to imagine that some good guy is in charge up there or something. So Debord is saying that the spectacle is sort of functioning now like religion used to function. Religion is still around, but basically a lot of it got defeated in the last 2 or 3 centuries. So it doesn't have the dominance that it did, in the Middle Ages or even the Renaissance. So instead of that, we have the spectacle, where you have Feuerbach, just before Marx, had this book called The Essence of Christianity, which Debord cites at the beginning of this chapter. And Feuerbach's thing, which is a little more simplistic than Marx, but basically he's saying, well, man is here on earth. He's a physical, social being, but he's projected his things into this imaginary heavenly realm. Like, he's saying there isn't any real evidence that there's gods and angels and things like this, but people have all these imaginations and aspirations and all this, and it ends up getting projected into these imaginary things up in heaven. And we want to bring this back down to earth. But Debord then, like Marx, is sort of contrasting with Feuerbach and saying, well, they did bring this stuff back to earth, but it turned out to be pretty miserable. It's no longer projected into the heavens, it's projected into the earth, and but it's suppressed. Like, we can see things, but say we're watching a story, but things are kind of projected into the story in a way that, it kind of, we're attracted to it, we're gripped by something, but it's still kind of, it might as well be up in heaven for all the control over it that we have. We're just sort of looking at it and we're torn into suspense and all that. So we have all these potential human powers, technological powers and imaginative powers and so on, that could be used, and instead they get projected into these dystopia kind of science fiction sort of things, like, oh, here's this, master of a galaxy and all this kind of stuff, which is just, it's pretty pitiful if you think about it. It's projections of the miseries that have been throughout history on Earth. So now I'll let you come in and comment or question. Um, and I'm looking at the chat here. again later. So Mike Ballard is giving us a whole slew of things, which are kind of basically just summing up some of these things that Forbach and so on said. Peter, unmute yourself.
Yeah, just I guess something about 19 and 20, the very last line of 19, when I read that, where he says that the spectacle does not realize philosophy, it philosophizes reality, reducing everyone's concrete life to universe of speculation, just makes me think of kind of modern academics and just, it takes everyday life and categorizes everything. We're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about, polarization in society, just everything is discussed, but we're not really discussing actual life. The fact that we're living in capitalism, we're exploited, and we're living in this spectacular society. So it creates endless categories to study. Doesn't really do anything, as Marx said, right? That they've merely interpreted the world. And then I think, as you were saying in 20, really interesting to me, where he says it's like spectacular technology has not dispersed the mists, but it's brought them down to earth. And they become impenetrable and unbreathable. When I read that, I just think about how difficult life is for many people. And they're always told, well, we're going to have some kind of technological fix for climate change, or we're going to have some kind of a wonderful thing that you're going to be able to buy that'll make your life easier, right? Instead of actually being able to see that the problem with society is our social structure, right? That's causing the problems, that's causing people not to have the time to be able to raise their kids or to have a nice social life, or to not work 50 jobs to make ends meet, but they're instead you're just going to buy a faster car, is what this seems to be saying. And I think Debord hits the nail on the head there.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to continue here. We've got some short theses now. 21. This one is kind of playing off of Freud. As long as necessity is socially dreamed, dreaming will remain necessary. The spectacle is the bad dream of a modern society in chains, and ultimately expresses nothing more than its wish for sleep. The spectacle is the guardian of that sleep. Freud, when he's talking about dreams, he says one of the main functions of a dream is to enable you to sleep. You've got problems, so the dream kind of wrestles with the problems and tries to sort them out in one way or the other, symbolically or something. And at the same time, he says, I think Freud also says something like the dreams are the guardian of the sleep. It's not only that they are in the sleep, but they're the things that enable you to keep sleeping. So the spectacle is doing that. Number 22, the fact that the practical power of modern society has detached itself from that society and established an independent realm in the spectacle can be explained only by the additional fact that that powerful practice continued to lack cohesion and had remained in contradiction with itself. So again, I think that's literal. I hardly know how to explain it. Literally, like, why would a society detach something from itself and put that over itself that dominated it? Nobody in their right minds would think, well, sounds like an interesting thing to do. You would think that sounds like an idiotic thing to do. Why would a society do that? And the reason that it would make that separation is that the society itself within the society is intrinsically contradictory. It's got opposing classes, it's got opposing projects, opposing ideas, all kinds of competitions to seize this or that. And those competitions, those divisions, then can get reflected in, well, let's put this thing up here that will be the boss, that will be directing things. And then we're going to run into contradictions with that also. Anyway, it's just a reminder that this is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because if there was never any such thing as the spectacle or some of these other things, the society contains contradictions. And then he goes on to elaborate on that, number 23. The root of the spectacle is that oldest of all social specializations, the specialization of power. The spectacle plays the specialized role of speaking in the name of all the other activities. It is hierarchical society's ambassador to itself, delivering its messages at a court where no one else is allowed to speak. The most modern aspect of the spectacle is thus also the most archaic. And going on, in that same number 24, the spectacle is the ruling order's non-stop discourse about itself, its never-ending monologue of self-praise, its self-portrait at the stage of totalitarian domination of all aspects of life. The fetishistic appearance of pure objectivity in spectacular relations conceals their true character as relations between people and between classes. A second nature, maybe I'll stop and break that down before we go there. So the fetishistic appearance of pure objectivity is when you look at society, at the people in their different classes and varieties and places and all that, it looks like this is an objective thing. These are differences out there, and this is how reality is. You're looking at, you see a news program and you see some event happening, a disaster or a debate or whatever it may be. But this fetishistic appearance, like, oh, that's how it is. I think there was some news program back when I was young, where the newscaster would say, and that's in the program, and that's how it is, good night, everybody, after having given this little selection of stories, it's like saying, well, we have just presented you with reality, and now see you tomorrow.
That was Walter Cronkite.
Walter Cronkite. So anyway, this is concealing the true character of relations between people and between classes. Now, he goes on, a second nature, capital nature, with its own inescapable laws seems to dominate our environment. So I'm going to go back here. This comes from Marx, and early Marx is saying, in Marx's youth, in that early 19th century, the idea was, which sounds a little more old-fashioned to us now and politically incorrect or something, but the idea was that nature was sort of not an enemy exactly, but an opponent in a sense that we had to get control of. If we didn't get control of it, we'd starve to death. We get control of it by learning how to domesticate agricultural products, by learning how to hunt animals, by learning how to put a roof over our heads, and et cetera. And so the idea is that primitive man or early societies like hunter-gatherers and so on like that, it was seen like, man, they are really struggling. Like if a drought comes in, they're just going to starve to death. They're not intrinsically a strong kind of animal like a lot of other animals are. They have only, their brains are their big strong point, and they need to use their brains in order to ward off nature, like to prevent the saber-toothed tiger from breaking in, or, et cetera, et cetera. And so the idea was that early man was battling against nature. Again, we wouldn't use the same terminology, but the idea is that nature is all that stuff out there that you can't control. It can bring a flood or an earthquake or any number of things, and you have to figure out what's going on and find ways to defend yourself from it. And then ultimately maybe to conquer it a little bit, like to make it, to domesticate the wild plants or something. So that's the first nature. And so the older project for humanity was to learn how to control nature. And to do that, you have to learn how to understand nature, etc. So now what happens when in the 19th century, humanity has to a great degree learned how to control nature, not all of it by any means, but rather impressively. They can tear down a forest and build a city there. No other animal could remotely do something like that or would even think of it. And they can even do things like learn how to treat certain diseases and, all these things. So, okay, we've somewhat conquered nature, so things should be really hunky-dory now. But in the process of doing this, we've set up factories, industrialization, all these kind of things. And now we have nationalisms and international wars and all kinds of stuff. Wait a minute, why are these things in there? And so Marx is saying that we now have a second nature, i.e., a second opponent that has come up. After we conquered the first nature, this second nature is coming in and bugging us just the same. It's also killing us by the millions. It's leading to, famines and diseases and wars and stuff like this. So we have to look at that as something else that humanity needs to get control of, needs to understand, and so on. So anyway, Marx goes into this, and Debord is just sort of updating that aspect of Marx. He said, a second nature with its own inescapable laws seems to dominate our environment. What is that nature? We're now learning about it. It's the spectacle, or it's capitalism, or whatever. But the spectacle is not the inevitable consequence of some supposedly natural technological development. On the contrary, the society of the spectacle is a form that chooses its own technological content. If the spectacle, considered in the limited sense of mass media that are its most glaring superficial manifestation, seems to be invading society in the form of a mere technical apparatus like TVs and cameras and movies and all that, it should be understood that this apparatus is in no way neutral and that it has been developed in accordance with the spectacle's internal dynamics. It doesn't mean that the technology is in accordance. It means the technology is neutral. I mean, it's just a machine, what are you going to, but the spectacle is saying, build that machine, improve that machine, forget this other thing over here. It's choosing the things, like it will choose things like build a bigger bomb. That's what we want. Build and it's not choosing things except sort of incidentally, like, oh, find a way to feed hungry people or stuff like that. That kind of gets in the more debated thing, like if the social needs of the age in which such technologies are developed can be met only through their mediation, namely the spectacle's internal dynamics, if the administration of this society and all contact between people has become totally dependent on these means of instantaneous communication, it is because this communication is essentially unilateral, i.e., one way. It's from it to us, and there's no arguing back. It's not a dialogue or collaboration. The concentration of these media thus amounts to concentrating in the hands of the administrators of the existing system the means that enable them to carry on this particular form of administration. The social separation reflected in the spectacle is inseparable from the modern state, that product of the social division of labor that is both the chief instrument of class rule and the concentrated expression of all social divisions. So I think I'll stop there briefly. Questions or comments? Ed.
Yeah, if we start back to 20 and work our way through to 24, a number of things are going on. First one, we are sort of indirectly and then increasingly directly speaking about communication, very particular kind of communication that is top-down, monological. There is no dialogue. It is a command from above, much like religion. So that's the first aspect. And now we have it, and I wrote on the side here, corporate cable news. So we have all the cable news outlets who all seem to cover the same material. We see the world through the same prism because corporations own news outlets. So they're going to be giving us their version of reality. So we have this weird sense of communication within this reified society, this spectacular society. And again, you've stressed it and absolutely correct. The spectacle isn't just TV. It is the whole totalizing effect of capitalism upon society. But from 20 to 24, there's not only the sense of communication as a thread that ties these various sections together, this monological development, but then there's also, when I'm thinking back here, just the line in 21, the bad dream of a modern society in chains. As soon as I saw that, I'm thinking, okay, Rousseau, I'm thinking the social contract, and then I'm thinking back to the writers of that period who were complaining about the role that religion was playing in their world, and of course, the ability or the attempt, not successfully, to pacify the masses by saying, look, it's a better tomorrow, it's a better afterlife. I know life is difficult, but when you die, I promise you'll go to heaven. Just please keep giving us your money. And I just see this sense of the same hierarchical structure that's going on. We have this sort of religious structure, top-down communication. We are being commanded to behave in a certain way. So we have no communication in a dialogical kind of way. And then secondly, we have this world where any kind of desires have been abstracted and then refracted and reflected back to us as whatever desire we may have. It better be about consumption, because anything else other than that just doesn't fit.
No. Thank you. I'm going to keep moving on here, and then we'll stop periodically for anything. Number 25, separation is the alpha and omega of the spectacle. The institutionalization, remember the name of this chapter is called Separation Perfected. So that's kind of the theme. The institutionalization of the social division of labor in the form of class divisions had given rise to an earlier religious form of contemplation, the mythical order with which every power has always camouflaged itself. Religion justified the cosmic and ontological order that corresponded to the interests of the masters, expounding and embellishing everything that their societies could not deliver. We'll be coming back to that. In this sense, all separate power has been spectacular. But this earlier universal devotion to a fixed religious imagery was only a shared belief in an imaginary compensation for the poverty of a concrete social activity that was still generally experienced as a unitary condition. We'll be coming back to that, so that's important. In contrast, the modern spectacle depicts what society could deliver. But in so doing, it rigidly separates what is possible from what is permitted. The spectacle keeps people in a state of unconsciousness as they pass through practical changes in their conditions of existence. Like a factitious god, it engenders itself and makes its own rules. It reveals itself for what it is, an autonomously developing separate power based on the increasing productivity resulting from an increasingly refined division of labor into parcelized gestures dictated by the independent movement of machines and working for an ever-expanding market. In the course of this development, all community and all critical awareness have disintegrated. And the forces that were able to grow by separating from each other have not yet been reunited. That's a magnificent thesis, and I want to make a few comments on it. So we have this distinction that there have always been these spectacular separations between the, reflecting the rulers and the ruled. But in the earlier societies, and this could go back even in the more primitive societies, so-called, I'll just use that as shorthand. It's of course especially truer like when you get to the Near Eastern monarchies and empires and stuff like that in the ancient world. But even in earlier societies, you had chiefdoms and, some kind of hierarchy going there. And the religion, the stuff that they have, which in my literary group we're talking about this year, we're looking into folk tales and poems of primitive peoples and stuff like that later in the year. We have all these myths that are sometimes interesting, sometimes uninteresting, stories about, this sun god did this, or the woman who lives in the moon did this, and this animal who, back in the era when all the animals spoke, they did this, and this is how the world was created, and then Coyote, that rascal, came in and caused some disturbance. And you have all these stories that sort of, in one way or the other, they kind of talk about all this imaginative stuff, that happened, and they include the things like this is why you must obey your chief or something as a sort of one aspect of them. But what they're doing is that they're talking about stuff that they can't deliver, their societies can't do. They talk about flying up to the sun or the moon or something like that, like as if you could be a bird and do that. And it's something obviously that was not even remotely doable. But on the other hand, so there's a big separation there. But on the other hand, the society in which this is happening was still, quote, generally experienced as a unitary condition. So even though there were hierarchies there, the people in those societies, for them, that was it. Their whole thing, and especially in the more primitive societies, a lot of times, they probably never even thought of, they had these stories about all this stuff they couldn't do. Now, contrast modern society, the spectacle depicts what society could deliver. We have all these movies of science fiction. We have these movies about great love affairs, about dystopias and utopias and, dramatic historical things, and just a jillion different things in novels and poems and operas and artworks and so on. But the thing is, our society could deliver that. We wouldn't have to say, oh, that was a cool sci-fi movie. These guys were running all over. We could build cities like that now. I mean, it's silly. I'm just kind of exaggerating here, but, if we can build rockets that go to the moon or even Mars and stuff like this, we could do all sorts of far out things. The question is, would we want to do this or that or something? But there's a huge number of things. But what we do instead is that we watch a movie about it. And the movie includes this stuff. Oh, this is in the distant future where people can go faster than light in rocket ships or something. And yet still, when you look at it, it's Emperor so-and-so is doing. I mean, we're like going backwards to this silly kind of stuff that you would have thought would be totally outmoded by now. and silly issues. So he's saying our society could deliver this, but in so doing, in presenting these things, it separates the possible from what's permitted. These things are possible, but they're not going to be permitted. Nobody is going to do these things because it costs billions of dollars, and the billionaires aren't interested in doing it. You know, if you could say, oh, this guy could finance something. Yeah, they could, although um, uh, so what's happening is that we're kind of kept in a suspense. We're seeing all these things that if we, figuratively speaking, just looked out the window, there's more miraculous things that could be right out there. We don't even have to go to Mars to do these things, but we have these fantasies of this kind of stuff. So, you know, instead we're caught up in this thing that he kind of dramatically said, you know, autonomous separate power based on increasing productivity, or, you know, going through all this. So the forces in the society that we're able to grow by separating from each other. So what he's talking about there is things like science, arts, you know, various kinds of knowledges and stuff that used to be under the uh, umbrella of the church or something like that and not getting very, okay, now they're free. Now you can have, you know, all these things. And so they do indeed develop these fantastic inventions and all this stuff, but they grow separately and they haven't yet become reunited. If we're going to have a liberated society, these things have to come back together again, not just be off in a free enterprise wacky thing, you know, who can get to the moon first. Bishop.
All right. I think of two streams. I think about the symposium and the idea that Zeus separates men and women who are going to be eternally estranged from each other, but our human potential is estranged from itself. There's also the Zizek point from Occupy Wall Street when he said, you know, we can dream about science fiction and destroying worlds, but we can't think of an anti-capitalist present moment. We can't dream that. So I think when he says all community and all critical awareness have disintegrated, and the forces that we're able to grow by separating from each other have yet to be reunited. I don't know whether he's talking about Zizek or he's talking about Plato, but something isn't united. Is it our imagination?
Right. Yeah, it's all our potentials.
Our potential.
You know, that may
Okay, our
express themselves.
dreams.
Here's a scientific thing, here's a psychological thing, here's an artistic, creative thing, and something. And
because he has the dream point earlier,
yeah,
the Freud point about us dreaming.
yeah.
And that seems to not fit in the other.
Oh, a lot of these things don't fit. That's
Right.
why there's contradictions.
Yeah, of
You know, the
course.
dream can be something that's protecting the thing, and it can also
Sure.
be arousing dissatisfaction and causing
Right.
revolts or
Right,
so
right.
just we're not going to get one unitary picture of how everything is
No.
here.
But
We're
do you
just
think
getting
he's
different
thinking
strands.
about Plato there, or what do you think he's thinking with this separation? Or is it alienation, just basic Marx alienation?
All of the above.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Peter?
Yeah, I wanted to comment a little bit on that line in 25 where he says, the modern spectacle depicts what society could deliver, but in so doing, it rigidly separates what is possible from what is permitted. And whenever I read this, I think of modern reality television. So we have a network that shows us people buying and living in these wonderful houses, right? And yet we have homeless people and people living in squalid conditions. We could do all of that, and the spectacle is showing us we could, but we're kind of numbed into just saying, oh, I wish I were, you know, a millionaire, I could have this house. Or there's a Food Network, right, where people are eating delicious food, and yet everyone has food insecurity, right? Or many people do, or they're starving. And the same thing with like the Travel Channel, right? I mean, this is a spectacle beaming into our eyes how we could have neighborhoods that are interesting and places we want to live, and yet we're being told you got to have $1 million to travel to this interesting place. We can't even think about making our own neighborhoods a place where we might want to, you know, live and work and those kind of things.
Right. Zach? unmute yourself. You're still muted.
Yeah, I'm still muted. Sorry about that. Let me unmute myself. Well, I guess when I was reading this, I was sort of picking up on a slightly different emphasis. I guess what I get from 25, to some extent, is again that the spectacle is something much larger than the appearances that we're sort of all very, very clearly aware of, and that it's, if not synonymous, very closely related to the absolutely central role that technology plays in our society. And it gets back to a point that Jacques Ellul made in the Technological Society, and Ellul and Debord were sympathetic with each other, and Ellul was even invited to be a member of the SI at one point, and he and Debord mutually decided that Ellul's views of religion would make that a really bad idea. But Ellul's point was that technology is not neutral, that technology has its own inherent logic, and once society starts embarking on a road of technological progress, it's impossible to undo that logic. And it's essentially the logic of efficiency, that the overriding value in society becomes what is the most efficient, most productive way of doing something. And once you buy into that, all other human values essentially fall by the wayside, including spiritual values, including many of the values that I think many of us would probably consider make life worth living. And I guess that's what I get from the sentence near the end of 25, that the spectacle reveals itself for what it is, in an autonomously developing separate power based on the increasing productivity resulting from an increasingly refined division of labor into parcelized gestures dictated by the independent movement of machines. And unless one can find a way out of that technological mindset, and a path away from that absolute reliance on economic efficiency, I'm not sure that any of these problems get resolved. And it's not sort of just capitalism. You have non-capitalist systems that also place a premium on economic efficiency and growth, and all the other obviously good, seemingly necessary ideals of economic development. But I think there's a fundamental contradiction there that Debord is working with somehow.
Well, we will get to this. We will come back. I will say that I myself am very dubious about that anti-tech kind of perspective, as was Debord. And I don't think there's something magic about machines that means once you have a machine, you can't stop. That's just silly. I mean, we have all kinds of machines that can be used for rational purposes, but the present society is not using them for rational purposes for the most part. There are little incidental rational purposes, like a lawnmower does do its job of cutting the lawn, or something, and something else does its job of, about moving you from one place to another. But in themselves, those things, to think that the technology itself is a problem and you need to get away with it or reduce it drastically or something, I think is misunderstanding it any more than I think the critique of capitalism and of the spectacle and so on is not that it's technological or that it's da-da-da. In a way, it's that it's too timid. Like there are things that various kinds of technologies could be developed far more than they are. But the point is, for what purposes and how? Like if we look at how technologies are used under capitalism, of course they're going to be fucked up. Most of them, for example, are going to be building armaments and things like that. That doesn't mean that there's some inevitability, like if you have techniques, you're going to have a nuclear war or whatever. Anyway, we'll come back to this because I have talked about it and even written some stuff about it that we will get to. Sid.
Well, just in terms, Zach, like to respond to something that Zach was talking about efficiency. But I think you were, when you were, my sense was that you were focusing on what people are considering economic efficiency. So there's like two things I wanted to say about what Zach said, what you said, Zach. One is, so sometimes one might not criticize efficiency if it wasn't only economic efficiency. If efficiency was viewed differently, if the definition of efficiency was somehow human efficiency, or, you know, something that was not just economic dollars and cents, but also whatever, spiritual, if you want to break it into little subjects. Okay, so that's that point. In which case, maybe efficiency is good, if you don't think of it in terms of like a strictly monetary or economic thing. The other thing is a question you talked about, that was the gestalt of even non-capitalist societies. And my question is, what are, I don't know of any other
Yeah, there aren't any.
I mean,
I mean, there are sort of more or less developed capitalist societies is all there.
yeah,
There hasn't yet, except briefly, been.
sometime, did you have like something in mind when you were saying that, Zach, or?
Yeah, it's a obviously highly imperfect example, but to the extent that there have been attempts at non-capitalist societies on a fairly widespread basis, whether it's Soviet Russia or Maoist China, however semi-capitalist they may have been, they still worshipped efficiency very much in the same way that
Well,
more
of course,
conventional
because
capitalists.
those societies are ultra-capitalist.
Yeah,
They're
State-
just more backward, vicious versions of it, is all that you can say. I mean, that has nothing to do with what Debord is talking about. I mean, and Debord will go into that later. It's just like Stalinism is like a more backward version of capitalism. It's like what a country does when
State capitalism.
Yeah. I'd like to pursue here these things a little bit on 26, and then we'll come back. The general separation of, and in these next several things are largely taking off on Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, where he talks about, the alienation of the worker and so on. The general separation of worker and product tends to eliminate any direct personal communication between the producers and any comprehensive sense of what they are producing. With the increasing accumulation of separate products and the increasing concentration of the productive process, communication and comprehension are monopolized by the managers of the system. The triumph of this separation-based economic system proletarianizes the whole world. It means in the sense that they use it like it turns everybody into proletarians, basically, or almost everybody. Due to the very success of this separate production of separation, the fundamental experience that in earlier societies was associated with people's primary work is in the process of being replaced in the sectors near the cutting edge of the system's evolution by an identification of life with non-working time, with inactivity. But such inactivity is in no way liberated from productive activity. It remains dependent on it in an uneasy and admiring submission to the requirements and consequences of the production system. It is itself one of the products of that system. There can be no freedom apart from activity, and within the spectacle, activity is nullified. All real activity having been forcibly channeled into the global construction of the spectacle. Thus, what is referred to as a liberation from work namely the modern increase in leisure time, is neither a liberation within work itself, nor a liberation from the world shaped by this kind of work. None of the activity stolen through work can be regained by submitting to what that work has produced. The reigning economic system is a vicious circle of isolation. Its technologies are based on isolation, and they contribute to that same isolation. From automobiles to television, the goods that the spectacular system chooses to produce also serve it as weapons for constantly reinforcing the conditions that engender lonely crowds. With ever-increasing concreteness, the spectacle recreates its own presuppositions. I'm going to go on. 29. The spectacle was born from this world's loss of unity, and the immense expansion of the modern spectacle reveals the enormity of this loss. The abstractifying of all individual labor and the general abstractness of what is produced are perfectly reflected in the spectacle, whose manner of being concrete is precisely abstraction, being abstract. In the spectacle, a part of the world represents itself to the world and is superior to it. The spectacle is simply the common language of this separation. Spectators are linked solely by their one-way relationship to the very center that keeps them isolated from each other. The spectacle thus reunites the separated, but it reunites them only in their separateness. I'm going to just finish this chapter here, and then we'll just jump around. These are all dealing with much the same topic. 30. The alienation of the spectator, which reinforces the contemplated objects that result from his own unconscious activity, works like this. The more he contemplates, the less he lives. The more he identifies with the dominant images of need, the less he understands his own life and his own desires. The spectacle's estrangement from the acting subject is expressed by the fact that the individual's gestures are no longer his own. They are the gestures of someone else who represents them to him. The spectator does not feel at home anywhere because the spectacle is everywhere. Workers do not produce themselves, they produce a power independent of themselves. The success of this production, the abundance it generates, is experienced by the producers as an abundance of dispossession. As their alienated products accumulate, all time and space become foreign to them. The spectacle is the map of this new world, a map that is identical to the territory it represents. The forces that have escaped us display themselves to us in all their power. The spectacle's social function is the concrete manufacture of alienation. Economic expansion consists primarily of the expansion of this particular sector of industrial production. The growth generated by an economy developing for its own sake can be nothing other than a growth of the very alienation that was at its origin. Though separated from what they produce, people nevertheless produce every detail of their world with ever-increasing power. They thus also find themselves increasingly separated from that world. The closer their life comes to being their own creation, the more they are excluded from that life. The spectacle is capital, accumulated to the point that it becomes images. Okay, that's all we're going to read today, and we've got about almost half hour to discuss any and all of these theses here. So have at it. Ed.
Yeah, so just very briefly to go back to 25, and then I will let everyone else talk
Sure.
about the
No
rest
problem.
of them. last week, I believe John Stewart had a really brilliant piece on AI and started it by showing all of the wonderful things that AI could do. It can solve the world's crises and climate change and poverty and blah, blah, blah. But first, it's going to now take away 50 million jobs. And sure, leisure time, well, that's not our problem. And we just become prompters, right? We just simply feed this machine, this cloud. And I just thought in a matter of just a few minutes, John Stewart realized what is in the chapter here, or in the section. The modern spectacle depicts what society could deliver, all these wonderful changes, but in doing so, separates what is possible from what is permitted. Sorry, we have to throw everybody out of work. And I just thought that was such a smart thing. Then very briefly over to 28, this vicious cycle of isolationism. I think Gunther Anders in one of his books talks about how man is or humanity increasingly isolated, starting with theaters. Then it's like first regular theaters, then movie theaters, then television, then wearing headphones, and then being inside a car. And now I look around and everybody basically has cut out the world, wearing earbuds, walking around, looking at their phones. And that is, to me, a vicious cycle of isolationism, using technologies that are given to us as your life will be better. Your life will be fantastic. And you buy into it. So just that's all I wanted to say on those two passages, because it looks into the future in the most depressing way, but it's up to us to look at it and change it. As Marx had said, it's, again, such a brilliant book because it takes us no time to think of modern examples that still fit so well with what he says.
Yeah. Yes, Peter.
Yeah, just I guess 2 points. One on 28 and the vicious circle of isolation. When I read this, I can't help but think about people, I mean, especially young people who feel very isolated and alone today. And yet, what do I see them doing constantly? And we do it too. We have our smartphones and we're talking to people around the world when there's people sitting right next to us. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a place and there's people who are just sitting around and they're not talking anymore, right? Before, I mean, this is kind of the advancement of the spectacle. He talks about automobiles and television from his era, but those are older, I think, forms of the spectacular domination. And now we've gotten to a point where we feel we need these smartphones to even meet people when there's people sitting right next to us that we don't even talk to. And then 33, where he says they find themselves increasingly isolated and separated from that world. I mean, to me, this is Marx in the economic and philosophic manuscripts talking about humanity separation from nature. I mean, but I think going even further, where we've got the capacity to live in harmony with the world if we wanted to, and yet we're destroying it, right? We're separated from it. We don't see ourselves as part of it, and we don't even, the spectacle doesn't even let us see how we could fix that, right? I mean, we don't know that capitalism is causing it. We're just being told, well, all these techno fixes are going to do it, and it can't. So,
Yeah. Judy. You're muted. There you go.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about how technology now is affecting the younger generation, the teenagers, and how harmful it is. And my grandson, who's 17, was saying that he saw a video of kids walking down a hall that was like 20 years old or something, and they were all talking to each other and yelling at each other and acting like teenagers. And he said his mind was just blown because at his school everybody was quiet and they looked at their phone when they were walking down the halls. And I just thought, how sad. These teenagers are being denied human contact. They can't even, just yell at each other walking down the hall. And I was thinking how this is kind of doesn't really relate to what we're talking about so much, but it's kind of about how, how we get, like, I was thinking how everything we've been reading, not in the Situationist group, but in our other groups, all the the Nile saga and all that stuff about, like, we're kind of in this web of civilization, this vast web over us about how we have to be in a civilized society. And after the COVID, and I don't know how we get out of that. I don't know how we go back to having a joyous, wonderful life. Anyway, after the COVID, I was up the street. There's a park up the couple blocks away from me, and these Cal students, I think they were mostly Cal students. Anyway, they were playing volleyball, and it was the first time, you know, the park had been open and kids could go out and play, and the joy of these young college kids playing volleyball together, it was palpable. I mean, I was just like overcome just walking by them. They were so happy and joyous to be out there playing with each other. I don't know how we get that back into our civilization, you know? I mean, I think that's kind of what they're talking when you talk about the situationist, this kind of ethereal vision of having a joyous society. That's kind of what I think about. But I don't know how we get back to that. I mean, I don't think the academics are helping us very much. And I don't know how we get away from that web of civilized behavior that we're all kind of
Well, this
encased
book,
in.
no easy recipes, but that's what this book is about. Zach.
Yeah, actually, I had a question about number 33. Ken, I was curious if you have any thoughts about what Debord means by saying that that people produce every detail of their world with ever-increasing power, and that the closer their life comes to being their own creation, the more they are excluded from that life. It's unusual for the Situationists to talk about people having that kind of power and control over their own lives. And I'm not entirely clear how Debord is thinking about that, or what it's supposed to, how he means it.
In a way, he's not saying that they have increasing, not that they are really creating their own life. He's saying, but they're doing things such as working that creates a rocket ship, or that creates a billion-dollar film, or you know, numerous things like this that and they're actually creating it. I mean, they're not thinking about it, but physically they're doing it, you know, this stuff. And yet this stuff that they do, like building a huge building, they're never going to live in it, you know.
It sounds like surplus value in a sense, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying that, you know, the closer their life comes to being their own creation, that sounds like stuff that their lives that they're doing, that they're participating in.
No, I understand.
It's an odd phrasing for Debord. I don't know, is he being sarcastic?
Yeah.
Is he?
Perhaps it's an unexpected. Let me just a minute here. Okay, here I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 3, thesis number 72, the last thesis there, and the unreal unity proclaimed by the spectacle masks the class division underlying the real unity of the capitalist mode of production. So get there here. What obliges the producers to participate in the construction of the world is also what excludes them from it. But they're forced into creating that, you know, it's not made out of clouds. What brings people into relation with each other by liberating them from their local and national limitations, good so far, is also what keeps them apart. What requires increased rationality, like you've got to do this or it won't work, is also what nourishes the irrationality of hierarchical exploitation and repression. what produces society's abstract power also produces its concrete lack of freedom. So I think that's a little more understandable and pertinent to this thing. Maybe his use here of the word creating their own life is a little misleading, but that's what he means. It means that, like when Marx talked about in an earlier era, he said workers who used to be scattered around as peasants or whatever are now brought together in a factory, in a city, and they're no longer particularly under the church's domination or the landlord's domination or, of the landowner's domination, that kind of thing. And so in a way, this is good. It's liberating them from these ignorant, provincial kind of superstitious, they don't know anything about other cultures or other
And should in
peoples.
theory break down isolation,
Yeah, yeah. They're all there together.
which is frightening.
And so you would think, okay, well, that's a good thing. And actually, Marx does think that's a good thing as far as it goes. He says,
It's a
but
threat.
look at what they're doing together. It's miserable. This is a bigger slavery than they ever endured in the farms. They're working 15 hours a day or something, in dangerous, ugly, unhealthy conditions, breathing coal dust and, the whole works, everything you can imagine. But they are being brought together, which at that time, Marx is saying, that could be interesting because they're in a miserable thing. They really have nothing to lose here, except their chains is the thing. They could hardly be in any worse position. They're just barely being paid enough to eke out a survival and to raise unhealthy children for the next generation. So you would think that, okay, yeah, but they're brought together, dangerously together. Like for peasants in a field, what the hell are they going to do? If they do anything, they can be shot or beat up or arrested or something. But what if you have like 1,000 people in a factory and the factory was very expensive to the person who built it? All that. And what if the workers took over that factory and refused to move? You can say, well, yeah, we'll send in the troops. Wait a minute, don't damage that machinery. don't shoot your cannon in there. I spent $1 million creating that. And anyway, they can exchange their experiences, say, what are we doing this for? Could this be different? And so indeed, at that time, back in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, and so on, there were workers in especially England, but also in France and Germany and elsewhere, who joined the First International, like saying, yeah, we got to do something about that. I mean, there were also unions, but they were saying we got to go further than these unions, they're not doing very much and blah, blah, blah. So they were brought together, and you could say that's good. But in being brought together, they're also stripped of a lot of those human qualities that, when they were peasants, maybe they could have a square dance or something. Yeah, they're out, at least they're out in the fields in the open air or something. They're not breathing all this. So you have kind of a mixed thing there, but Marx was playing on those contradictions, that they're bringing them together, but they're also separating them. And Debord goes into this later on, especially in the chapter 7, where he talks about the organization of territory, how people have come together in the cities, dangerously together, because that's where all the revolutions take place practically. So, but the modern city then separates them again. And they separate them into like the family cell. You're in your own little cubby hole watching TV. Or in modern cases, maybe you've got an internet, a computer, and you're looking at stuff on the web, which is, at least I may say in passing, is a big improvement over television. You couldn't do anything with TV basically, except write a letter that they would throw in the wastebasket. But at least online, you can complain about something and talk about, but so we have an ambiguous thing going on there. But I think this is the gist of this, is that they're brought together, but the more they're brought together, paradoxically, and this is going back to Marx, the more powerless they are, because they're building these things that are going to turn against them. I mean, almost literally, they may be building the guns that policemen will shoot them with, or building the prisons that they will be put into if they rebel, et cetera, or building the things that are going to send them to war and so on like that. So I think that's the gist of, you're right to point out, I think that is a little bit, the use of the word creating their own life is, even though he's negating it, it's sort of, I think that should answer that. John Salt, please unmute yourself.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I'm really enjoying how the abstraction with which Guy Debord lays out things allows one to put in your own examples. For example, in thesis number 30, he says, the individual's gestures are no longer his own. They are the gestures of someone else who represents them to him. And I thought this is like with the fashion industry where you're wearing a Gucci or a Fendi or this kind of thing, and you're allowing the corporations and those people to kind of represent who you are. I don't know if that's exactly what he means there or not, but I enjoy how it's very kind of lucid, and yet it allows you to kind of think into the examples. And this also made me think how it's amazing. He's kind of x-raying the society of the 60s of his time, and yet he's at the same time being completely prescient of the future, because whatever points he's making here are like exponentially exaggerated in our time. So things don't hit me as being false, but being like hyper what he's saying here. And it's just like mind-blowing how he gives this paradigm. And yet you can see like, wow, now he's talking about technology, AI. Wow, how would he think of AI? Well, what he's saying here makes total, it just goes from one thing to another. So I just want to thank you for explicating it, and just wanted to mention that.
Thank you for that. Good point. Bruce, haven't heard from you very much.
Some of what's been discussed reminds me very much of the Toyota production system and how it marked a change in the way production was organized. And what I mean specifically by that is that one of the innovations of the Toyota production system was to involve the workers in the actual process of running production and achieving and in shaping decisions up to a point, but all for the purpose of achieving the goals of the corporation. And the end result was that it optimized the exploitation of the workers by the corporation and got the workers to, participate in their own enhanced exploitation. And that there's a similar dynamic at work in terms of what worked in the Toyota production system to what you've been talking about now.
Yeah, very good point. Rael.
Yeah, it's interesting how the points all fit together, like in 28, where he refers to the spectacular system, chooses to produce, also serve it as weapons for constantly reinforcing the conditions that engender lonely crowds, and bring that into the gestures of someone else who represents them to him. Let's look at the people who are sitting around this table here, who are representing, because that's all we're doing. We're just representing a critique of a critique that happened a long time ago. And it produces an illusion that we are here participating in an activity that will bring about a transformation out of the spectacle. And it's just a concept to look at what we're doing here as part of the spectacle, and to play with that. That's
To play with it indeed.
Yeah.
As Debord says later, to see. It is obvious that ideas alone cannot lead beyond the existing spectacle. At most, they can only lead beyond existing ideas about the spectacle. To actually destroy the society of the spectacle, people must set a practical force into motion. A critical theory of the spectacle cannot be true unless it unites with the practical current of negation in society. And that negation, the resumption of revolutionary class struggle, can for its part only become conscious of itself by developing the critique of the spectacle, which is the theory of its real conditions, etc. I'll go.
So we're looking at a theory that can really only develop within the context of practice.
That's right.
In other words, what are we going to do when we walk away from this into our daily lives?
That's a good question. So, since I present this in a sort of one-way thing, I mean, I'm just saying, here I am, come and join us if you want. I can explain or state that these things have certain implications, but there's a big difference between hearing that and pursuing that. And I have to say, this may sound egotistical or something like that, but back in 1970, when I was first discovering these things, I had questions like that and what many other people have said. And I really got into it. And I said, I don't know what this, I mean, I talk about it in my autobiography. I'm not sure what this would mean, but I'm going to go out there and try something. And then I would try something, say, well, it didn't work very well, or maybe that did work pretty well. That's interesting. I think I'll do more of that. And as a result of those little, very modest experiments in agitation or just going out to kind of stir up something, I felt like within a relatively short time, I was understanding this stuff. And I knew what Debord was talking about quite well. And I've run into so many people since that time, more than 50 years ago, and a lot of them sort of have an idea, oh, yeah, this is interesting stuff. But there's only a small number that really know, of course. I mean, we don't even talk about that issue that you're talking about because it's just totally obvious. And we know what is, going on. Yeah, this is maybe sounding kind of obnoxious or something, but what I mean is these ideas are not just ideas that we're talking about here, like this is the spectacle is this or that or something like this. These are things that you could use. And what I did in some cases, I actually used things from this book in a leaflet, for example, that stirred people up and got people pissed off or, challenged people in various ways, stuff like that. And I'm not saying that doing that is the way the society is going to be changed, but it's of the same nature. It is why I've kept being interested in this, whereas many people who just sort of read the book and said, "Oh yeah, I think that's pretty interesting." Well, I'd rather do other things or something, and they just kind of drift off. But for me, the things that Debord and these others are talking about is really it's it's how this world is working, and it's got a lot of hints about things that can be done. And it's just one person doing that. It's true, and it's 60 years ago and so on. But nevertheless, it's far more relevant than practically anything else I can think of. I mean, everything else just sounds like trivial by comparison. to the depth. I mean, he can say something in one sentence that teaches you more than a whole book would. You know, it gives you an idea. Oh, yeah, that's a whole different way to look at what my position in life is, what my relations are with people, what all this. And of course, just having said that, you can't then go, okay, well, that's the solution. Go out and make a leaflet or go, you know, you have to struggle with that. I struggled with it to figure out what would that mean. And in a way, you know, I risked not life and limb, but I risked embarrassing myself, let's put it that way, by going out there and doing something that was kind of unheard of. You know what my first thing was, a disruption of a Gary Snyder poetry reading. It is like the last thing anybody would think of, including me. Gary Snyder was my hero. To go there and, you know, have this. And that came out of this. And after I had done that, I had been going in hesitantly, but after I had done it, I say, yes, now I get it. And it was because I had sort of put myself on the line there doing that. And I'm just saying, most of you are not going to do that, or you'll do something different. Who knows what you might take from this? I'm just saying that this is, if you're talking about like a book group, like if you read a novel, it has a few suggestive things, or it's kind of interesting, gives you a little different perspective on something or other. That's one thing. But in this case, it's like hundreds of things in here, you know, are condensed. I mean, this would take thousands of pages to really go into all the things he's talking about. And he's created this little thing that's just full of dynamite, really. So, yeah, you can say, well, yeah, but we're just talking about it. Well, you got to start somewhere. You know, just like he said about his films. People say, ha ha, you wrote about the spectacle, but you're making a spectacle of yourself by putting out a film. And he would say, you don't understand what I'm talking about. It's clear. You have not the dimmest idea. I'm not saying it's bad to make a film or to look at a film. Has nothing to do with what this is. You know, what I'm doing in a case like that is I'm going in the spectacle in order to attack it. And if you think you can attack it by just not going to movies or something, that has nothing to do with anything. You're not going to accomplish anything. You know, there's an active engagement in these things that is the answer to why are we looking at this? And again, this is what our group here is not a political group. We're not, I mean, I have been in groups where we had 5 or 10 people and we were reading it really closely because we were using it. And then we would say, well, does he mean this? Or that gives me an idea. Why don't we do this? And well, would that be spectacular or would this be this or that? You know, we engaged in it as a practical thing, just like you'd engage in a cookbook if you had somebody over for dinner and you're trying to figure out what to use and what not to use. And will this work? And it might be a flop. It might work. So all these things that I'm yakking about here are things that potentially come out of this book. And I don't want to fetishize the book. It's just an objective fact that it's this remarkable thing that there's practically nothing else to compare it with. And basically what it is that it doesn't have much to do with other books or other sociological ideas and things like that. It's the product of somebody who really engaged in this stuff since he was a teenager. So I think I'll stop there. Mike Bellard, unmute yourself, please.
Hi, I just want to thank Ken for getting us together in this to examine this theory, because this Zoom session is an example of praxis. It's where people get together and they make a critique of the system. Now, we're all separated all over the planet and everything, Now we can go out and do something about it by using the theory. That's what it's all about. So thanks, Ken. I gotta go because nature calls and everything.
Okay, thank you for Mike is all the way from Australia here, so he's usually our farthest away person. Let's see
Okay,
here.
bye-bye.
Peter.
Yeah, I wanted to address 33, but I did want to say to your point, Ken, that I got my doctorate in political theory because of this. In a way, this is the first work of political thought I read back in the 90s when I was a teenager. I've been struggling with it for 30 years. It inspired me. So there's something about this book. You're absolutely right. But about 33, I think, when he says, the closer their life comes to being their own creation, the more they're excluded from it. He's talking about workers, right? I mean, workers are excluded from what they produce. It's alienated labor. So I think it's kind of abstract here. And this is the problem with the first chapter for me also, is like, if you're just reading it, you're like, well, what is he saying here? He's talking about workers socially producing their own world. And the closer, like, our productivity gets better, we're better at our jobs, we make more stuff, right? But we're more exploited, we're more separated from the fact that we're producing things that could make us live in an equitable society. And so when he says that they come closer, life comes closer to being their own creation, for me, I don't think he's misspeaking. I think he's just, it's a very abstract way of saying we're like this close to having that world, and yet we're so far from it.
Yeah. Good point. Bruce.
Yeah, just quickly to a point that, or a question posed earlier by Judy. I mean, the logic of all this analysis seems to me pretty clear and self-evident. The logic of all this analysis is that the only way out of this is through the collective ownership and control of all of society, where we directly determine determine the content and direction of society. In other words, what would be the outcome of if we actually realized the situation where the slogan "All power to the workers' councils" became a living reality and became the dominant reality of the world we live in.
That's it in a nutshell.
And frankly, that's both the answer and poses the difficulty, is that it's so hard to get to the point where that achieving that state of affairs where the working class, the proletariat, becomes totally masters of their own destiny, becomes reality. It's extraordinarily difficult when you consider everything that you encounter every day in society.
Yeah. I mean, this may well never happen. There's no guarantee given here. It's just that those tendencies are within the society, and I definitely know that it's possible. I can say there's no question if you look at things that have happened in the past and people's potentials of creativity and community and so on. But it could easily not happen. This world could just go down the tubes as in ways that we can easily imagine now. But the one thing, if we are going to get out of it, we have to understand pretty much what it is, where we're at. And this book, along with a few other situationist things and a few other works, I think gives us a sense of, yes, this is how it works. So if we see that this flops, if this fails in various ways that seem ridiculous, how could people fall for this or something? Well, it becomes very obvious this is how people do fall for this stuff. They've been raised in a society where they've been fed this stuff, they're habituated to all these things, and they've let a situation arise where a few billionaires, like you could work thousands of years and you would never equal how much money they have, and it's up to them who they want to finance for president or for Congress or so. It's just completely idiotic things that, any objective looking at that would say, well, that's ridiculous. You're looking for things to go disastrously, and so far it has gone pretty disastrously. But with other things coming in, that do not leave me totally without hope. I'm going to look at the gallery view here now that we're down to about 20 people. Anybody who has not spoken yet, do any of you folks like Ivan in Rome, or Gerhard, or Sabrina, or Milena, speak if you're interested. Otherwise, we can wind up. Okay, well, we're a little after 7, so I guess I will wind up. I think my impression is that this has gone pretty well here. We did get through the chapter, which I sort of wanted to do. And so next time, I'll be sending you out a thing tomorrow, but next time we'll go for chapter 2, which is shorter. And I think we may well get through it, because I think it's just 7 pages or something like that. So we'll proceed in this way. And as I said, if you've got through this first chapter, I'm not saying it's simple, but I think all the other chapters are going to be somewhat more accessible to you. In more cases, you'll know what's being talked about, and all that. So I thank you for taking part in this, and I will now stop the recording.